But you know, the thing that always struck me when I was in President Ford's presence was that here I was with a man who for 895 days, when he had been President of the United States, was the most powerful man in the world. And you would never know it. He did not put on airs. He made you feel comfortable at home. He just spoke with you as another human being. He liked good, frank, honest talk. He loved U of M football. University of Michigan was his team, of course. And if ever, you know, you wanted to sort of put him back in a good mood, you know, just throw out a line about, you know, the most recent player that U of M had drafted, something like that. But that was the kind of down-to-earth, meat and potatoes guy he was. And that was the character that he used to establish a rapport with the American people. He's the perfect person to do it. One thinks of other great leaders from the Midwest. You know, when he went to Washington, who was president? Harry Truman, another plain-spoken Midwesterner. And President Ford, I think, used a lot of the same people-to-people ways to relate and establish those relationships that would help him become successful. He had the imagination for what this country needed, and he did have a sense that he was a good fit for the nation at that time, even though he had never sought the office of the presidency. The second way his imagination shows up, I think, is very interesting. The second way is, remember what's happening back in 1976. It's our bicentennial year. So this president is able to brush shoulders with all kinds of historians and patriots and people coming from around the world, Queen Elizabeth. People are helping us celebrate our bicentennial. Daniel Borston, as Librarian of Congress, is coming over and giving talks about the American founding. He is imbued with what this country's promise was in 1776, 1787. He's a quick study. You start to see, if you study his speeches, you start to see how the language of the founders comes increasingly into his awareness and into his speeches. It's genuine because Ford, from this man from the Midwest, had this patriotism, this love of his country. He comes from the heartland. And the founders find their way to his heart. His speeches, he's very underestimated as a speechifier because his delivery was not inspiring. But if you go back and you look at the speeches themselves, if you go back and look at the texts, you'll see how the founders' principles, their leadership qualities, come into his own awareness, and he applies them. So 1776, 1976, a huge part of his imagination of what the promise of this country is going to be, through the eyes, through the imagination even, of the founders. More concretely, President Ford was a policy wonk, and here too his imagination is very important. When he was at the University of Michigan, he had majored in economics. He knew how to handle budgets. He knew how to think about the economy. He was the last president, it said, who could take the federal budget home and actually read it and understand it. But President Ford had this knack for seizing good ideas. And one of those secrets to that was he had good advisors around him. He had a very strong sense of self. He was not intimidated by people. Other people might be flashier, the show horses. He was just a good workhorse behind the scenes. And he would let stronger egos and flashier personalities around him tell them what they were thinking. And then he would make decisions about that. But he was the one making the decisions. And one of the things that captured his fancy, you go back to the 1970s, energy. Now, Thomas Friedman has written about this in the New York Times. Go back and read President Ford's energy policy from his State of the Union in 1975. You know what, folks? We haven't even gone to his heights articulated in 1975, 33 years later. Shame on us. We're in the fix today we're in because we did not listen to leaders like President Ford who were trying to say, we need to get in gear. There are a lot of things we need to do. I'd like to read you a little bit of context here. As Thomas Friedman points out, early in his administration, Ford said that he would not sit by and watch the nation continue to talk about an energy crisis and do nothing about it, nor would he accept halfway measures which failed to change the direction that had made our nation so vulnerable to foreign economic interests. The President proposed firm but necessary measures designed to achieve energy independence for the U.S. by 1985. He was determined to keep this country strong and invulnerable to energy shocks. How we need people who would talk like that 10 years ago, say, before we got ourselves in the shape we're in now. Now, some of these policies, in his imagination, in his mind of where he wanted America to go as an independent energy nation, sound a little bit radical. They sound 70s-ish. They're policies we wouldn't necessarily accept today. But look at how capacious, how comprehensive these policies are. 200 nuclear power plants to be built. This is before 3 Mile Island. 250 new coal mines. 150 coal-fired power plants. 30 new oil refineries. Think of that. Think of the impact a Katrina would have on the Gulf Coast if you had many more refineries in different parts of the country. 20 new synthetic fuel plants, drilling for new oil wells, more than 18 million homes insulated against our Northwoods winters here and then the Gulf Coast summers. The sale of millions of new automobiles, trucks, and buses that would use much less fuel. All of this is laid out, and he used Franklin Roosevelt as the analogy here. Again, think of the images in Ford's mind. He goes back to an experience he knew back in 1942. He said President Franklin Roosevelt said that we would build 60,000 military aircraft in 1942. But you know, in 1943, how many aircraft we were building? 125,000 aircraft. Ford challenged the nation. He said, if we could do that in 1942, 43, we can certainly in 1975 to 1985 get this country to be energy independent so that we don't have to shape our foreign policy around chasing oil. Now, President Ford proposed these measures when oil was $10.75 a barrel. That's right. That was the average cost of imported crude at that point. He proposed the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. He phased out domestic price controls on oil to encourage investment. He also promoted investment of alternative fuels. What I'm saying with all of this is that, again, Ford's imagination was up to the task. We just didn't listen to him. We just didn't listen. Time sort of passed him by. But now his wisdom, what he was aware of, what he knew that this country needed, has really come back, I think, in full force. He wanted zero oil imports by 1985. We were importing 5 million barrels of oil a day then. Today we're importing 15 million barrels of oil. We've been going in exactly the opposite direction of what President Ford saw as a key thing that would help our country. So imagination. I want to say something else about his imagination. This is a new little twist in this talk on President Ford. You know, when you think about his imagination, think of the world he came from. This was a kid, he was born in 1913, but this is a kid who went to high school. Before he graduates from high school, the Great Depression breaks out, and then he goes off to serve in the military. He's fighting totalitarian dictatorships, Tojo in Japan and his theater in the Pacific. But there was a lot of turmoil that we don't know because we don't experience it anymore. History has been very kind to us as a generation, relatively speaking. That generation had it much tougher. You've heard about the greatest generation exploits and all. Well, there's really something to that. I know when I interview my dad and talk about all the things that they went through, the expectations, they had the low expectations they had. During World War II, there were 20 major commodities that were rationed. What do we ration today?